And then just very quickly, I wanted to let everybody know that we are, if you're in the Chicagoland area, we are presenting 2 full days SharePoint 2013 Administration and Architecture course. That is going to be taught by another one of our MVPs here at Protiviti, Doug Heminger, and the registration link is there. Certainly feel free to contact us at SharePointTraining@Protiviti.com. Again, that's SharePointTraining@Protiviti.com if you have any questions on that. So with that said, I will turn it over to Liam and look forward to the presentation.
Okay, cool, thank you. So, for those that don't know me, that's me hiding on an airplane, so you don't really know exactly what I look like. But as Jason said, I'm one of the SharePoint MVP guys, and I'm a solution architect here at Protiviti. My kind of main focus of area is I focus on development, the breaking and fixing and security and hacking of SharePoint. So kind of all the fun side of the SharePoint world, not necessarily the content types and building sites and all that kind of fun stuff, but the stuff that I find exciting. My details are at the bottom. There's my email address, and I do have 2 Twitter accounts that I kind of look after, as well as a couple of others, but the 2 that I use the most are my Hello, It's Liam and Hack SharePoint, and of course my blog site. Feel free to go there. Some of the content we're going to talk about today, I have posted some content like it on the blog site, as well as posting some other content onto on the SharePoint blog on the Protiviti website. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to do an overview of SharePoint security, and where else than authentication, authorization, and claims and things like that would we start? That's kind of the first step. So we'll talk about these, and then we'll have a 10-minute break. So based on times, it's just after 1 now. So we're going to go to around 2:30 and then have the 10-minute break. That'll give me a chance to catch up on questions and for everybody to have a quick drink and come back again. And then we'll do a bit more deeper dive into security. We'll talk about the infrastructure, we'll talk about plug-in holes, and then we'll actually go and take some questions and answers. So let us begin. So first of all, I wanted to kind of focus on authentication, because really in the security world, that's really where everything begins. Because if you want to make the most secure application in the world, then you wouldn't have anybody access it. So authentication becomes step number 1 that we need to go through. So what is authentication? I've talked about this many times before, and authentication is really just the verification of a claim, which is really I am who I say I am. When I go to the bank website and I put in my username, my password, my PIN code, that's me putting in and authenticating to validate who I am. Now SharePoint supports multiple types of authentication, and it supports Windows authentication, which for most of the SharePoint implementations that we see, and I'm sure that you guys have been involved in, that's really what we're using. We're using Active Directory, you're using base NTLM, we're using Kerberos or basic or anonymous and digest authentication, any of those mixes together. And that's the out-of-the-box configuration. We simply get the DVD or the ISO image, we boot it up, we install SharePoint, and we connect it to an Active Directory, and hey presto, it just works. Now what used to happen going forward is everybody wanted to build public-facing websites or extranets, and often didn't want to purchase the Active Directory licenses, didn't really want to house those in Active Directory because obviously associated costs and management. So lucky for us, SharePoint supports forms-based authentication, and so it supports an LDAP connection. So that would allow us to do either direct to some kind of directory service, whether it was something based on Oracle, for example, or Sun directory, or something similar, whether it was just the LDS using the lightweight directory services for Windows. And then, of course, it supports the Microsoft SQL Server and any of the ASP.NET membership and role providers, and we'll kind of look at those a little bit today. Also, an introduction that came in SharePoint 2010 was the SAML token-based authentication. So we're talking ADFS, so Active Directory Federated Services, or some of those third-party identity providers, down to a standard LDAP connection, and then moving up into the cloud with technology such as Azure ACS. Now, obviously, there's lots of other third-party components we could use. Some of those would be, for example, Auth0, or maybe we could use Ping Identity. There's a whole bunch of those products that are out there that support this idea of SAML token. And then, of course, what was introduced in 2013 and into Office 365 was OAuth. And OAuth is really based around what I would call the trust model. We're not really authenticating people. We're just doing some kind of authorization process by using a trust model, by me installing something as you would onto an iPhone or onto an Android phone, for example, and you get a little pop-up box that comes up that says, we want access to everything on your phone. And of course, no one ever reads that. They click OK and just install it. That's the kind of idea behind this OAuth design. And really, authentication is the first step to securing a SharePoint infrastructure. How are we going to have them authenticate themselves? Is it going to be an anonymous-facing website? If it is, it's really straightforward, because it's just going to be static content pages, and everything will just work for anonymous users. But at the point that we need to authenticate an individual, then we need to have this conversation. Who are they? Where are they coming from? How are they getting there? And really understanding what's the most secure mechanism for authenticating into SharePoint. So let's talk about Active Directory. This is the most standard approach. It really is. This utilizes groups and user accounts. The idea here is that you have security groups in Active Directory, and then you add them to the SharePoint site groups. And where possible, you try to minimize assigning permissions to individual user accounts. And there's some logic behind this. SharePoint is built on the .NET stack, and so any limitations that the .NET stack would have and the Windows stack would have as far as access controls are also affected into the SharePoint platform. So you've hopefully all read the TechNet and MSDN documentation that talks about the limits that are there to do with unique access controls applied to individual objects in SharePoint. This is where this comes to play. So in the ideal scenario, if you were using Active Directory, you would use security groups, you would assign the individual users to those security groups, and then you would add them to the SharePoint site groups, which would actually have the relative permission assigned to them. This means that your Active Directory security groups don't actually have a permission assigned to them as such. They just inherit it from the site group. Single sign-on doesn't really give single sign-on. I always like to ask that question when I'm presenting, is whether there is single sign-on using Active Directory. And the example would be if I have two SharePoint websites on the same infrastructure, both configured for Active Directory, and I authenticate into one of those, and then I access the other URL, do we expect it to single sign-on? And out of the box, the answer is no, it doesn't. What you actually have to do is force a browser configuration via a group policy change or a manual change into the browser. So there's a piece of this that doesn't work, this single sign-on. It doesn't actually work that way. The people picker, though, does work really well. It does underlying LDAP queries and goes and does a full name resolution. You can type in Joe Blogs and it will go ahead and look for Joe Blogs and do a validation of the individual user. So from a user experience of an end power user or an admin trying to assign permissions, they get to pick the individuals and they get to be resolved and then they apply. Now the difference is here, we're actually assigning permissions to a user object of some description or a group. We're not using attributes, we're not using claims, we're really just picking an actual group or individual. There's no specific configuration for this. If you decide one day to turn on build a virtual machine or a physical server, put it on the network and install SharePoint, it will just adopt the domain that it sits into. And so there's no configuration needed for that. And we don't need custom components to be developed because it's out of the box. The welcome control works great. It does name resolution. The login process is done automatically. There's nothing that needs configuring or customizing when using Active Directory. So how does the process work? So on the screen you'll see we have me, my laptop, my SharePoint environment, and my Active Directory server. So the very first request that is made from your machine, irrelevant of who you are, it's always requested as anonymous. Now you might think it's an authenticated request, but it isn't, because you're actually not authenticated at that point. Even though you may have logged into the network on your laptop and hey presto, you're like, well, I'm in, the first request is always anonymous. And you can see this if you do a fiddler trace. You'll actually see a 401 reject that happens, and then you'll see a redirect that takes you to where you need to go. So the first request is anonymous. SharePoint then interacts with that and says, hey, I need some Windows credentials of some description. You then post those credentials back to SharePoint. Unless you're prompted and you physically type them in, it's actually just going to repost the credentials that you actually have cached in the browser, on the workstation, and they'll get posted back to the SharePoint environment. Now, this is the key. SharePoint doesn't authenticate the credentials at that point. What actually happens is the credentials are actually posted through SharePoint to the IIS infrastructure. IIS is the one that's configured to talk to Active Directory and validate those credentials. So those credentials are passed all the way through to Active Directory. Active Directory goes ahead and validates, and obviously if it's correct, then it will go and obtain the group membership list. And this is important because this is where you get the security groups for the individual presented back. So if I belong to domain users, domain admins, site collection admins, and I've created these unique security groups, they get injected back as part of this user object that comes back. Once that hits the SharePoint environment, it creates the security token and authorization token, and that's done inside SharePoint. You may have heard that SharePoint has a STS, which is a secure token service. That's what part of the SharePoint world is all about. It grabs that information, signs everything as it should do, creates the authn token, sends the web page to the client with the authorization token ready so that the client can receive that content. So there's a bunch of moving parts that take place, but the good thing about Active Directory is you don't see this. Unless you were to open a Fiddler page and really break down the traffic, the user experience is fantastic for this. I come to work, I plug the laptop in, I type in HTTP SharePoint, it just loads on my machine. I don't see bouncing around, I don't see anything else, it just loads as expected. Now, what if you didn't want to use Active Directory for licensing purposes, or you wanted to authenticate individuals against another application? If you're an association or non-profit, you may have an association management system, or you may want to authenticate users against a spreadsheet of usernames and passwords, or a SQL database, or you have an Oracle platform, or SAP, or CRM. Really, there's endless possibilities here. And this is where membership and role providers work really, really well. And they're still supported natively in SharePoint. They have been for quite some time. You could use them back in 2007. We have clients that use those still, 2010, 2013. As long as it's built within the .NET membership and role provider framework, you can use it. So this is all about .NET. It supports local authentication as well as remote authentication. So what we mean by that is you may have something installed on the machine, you may have a directory store configured on the SharePoint server, so it's going to be local, or you could be using web services or a database connection of some description. 99% of people that use the membership and role providers, it's for a remote authentication mechanism. I'm talking to a web service, I'm talking to a SQL database, I'm talking to a custom DLL component that allows me to grab and validate credentials. There's no single sign-on again. So if you have two websites, back to that scenario, two SharePoint websites, both configured for the membership and role provider, you access the one site, you go to the next one, it's going to prompt you for authentication again. So this is where we would need to build some kind of custom code into the solution that would allow single sign-on to take place. And it's normally done using some kind of cookies, token that's being passed backwards and forwards that basically says, I've already authenticated, next time you go to this other SharePoint site, some process in that code for that website will pick up information that's already been built. The membership provider piece is all about the user accounts. So the physical, what would be in code, the SP user objects, that's what the membership provider is all about. The role provider is the equivalent of Active Directory security groups, but they're referred to as roles. They still perform the same task. You're able to, in your membership and role provider and the mechanism that you provision for managing those user accounts, you will have the flexibility of creating accounts and then assigning individuals to those roles. You will need to make specific configuration. There's 3 locations for this: central administration, the secure token service, and the web application itself. And they are web config changes, and they're done within the configuration section that talks about membership and role providers. And you add in not only your connection strings that you may need to use, but you also add in the actual membership provider with its various parameters and the role provider with its various configuration. You will need to build custom components. A welcome control normally gets built because you'll want to perhaps use the single sign-on mechanism, and the welcome control can often be a great control to embed some of that logic into, as well as make sure that when you render the site it says welcome Liam or welcome Steve, whatever it's going to be. You're probably going to build a custom login mechanism. You may build a custom claim provider so that you can do name resolution, because moving to a membership and role provider, the people picker does a pretty decent job, but you may want to present it differently. For example, your membership and role provider may be actually logging in the individuals using a unique identifier, but you may be asking them to type in their email address. So think carefully about how you structure and build a membership and role provider, because really you want the unique identifier to be something different because the email address may change. So we've done a lot of client work where people come to the site, they put in their email address, the email address is then validated to get the unique identifier for the individual. The unique identifier is then passed for the authentication, and that becomes the unique identifier inside SharePoint. And at that point, the unique identifier is what comes up in the people picker. So if your ID was 123456, that's a bit useless when you're trying to just find individuals. So a claim provider fixes that process by allowing you to override the people picking process, so I can look for Liam and it would return those Liam that are in the system without you having to know the unique identifier. So the same kind of flow again. We have me and a laptop in SharePoint, and this time let's say we're going to use a bunch of users in a SQL database. So the first request once again is anonymous. This time we're going to send a forms-based login page from SharePoint, and this is out of the box. So if we're using out-of-the-box mechanism, you get that white page with the username password box on it. If it's a previous version of SharePoint, then it's probably going to be the one with the red components on. But what's probably going to happen is if it's a single URL, you may be presented with the realm picker first. So you can determine whether you want to log in with a Windows credential or with a forms-based credential. In the real production world, you wouldn't have that option. You would try to avoid the realm picker. But for our scenario, let's just say that it's presented back with forms-based login page. I send my credentials. We're not going to repost anything because we don't really have anything stored. That's that magic question of, do we store some kind of encrypted version of the usernames and passwords in a cookie, which I would advise against, and then do we decrypt it and post it and all that kind of fun stuff. But that's all around the design that you go with. We then pass those credentials off as part of the configuration. The membership and role provider will handle that. That's the code that gets ran inside SharePoint. We validate the credentials, and then as the Active Directory did, we obtain the role and membership list. And obviously this is not AD groups, this is the roles that are provided by the membership and role provider. We do the same thing again. We create the token, the authorization token, and any cookies that need to be created at the point of this, and then we send the web page back with an authorization token and any cookies that need to be passed, so we can then use that in the system. So it very much follows the same flow as the Active Directory, except the authentication piece, the single sign-on piece may be different. So one thing that was kind of new to the table that came in 2010 but really hasn't really taken off until really 2013 was the idea of a custom identity provider. The custom identity providers are really based around .NET. Once again, we get the idea of local authentication stores and remote authentication stores. We get an inherent single sign-on via the browser and some web application configuration that would tell us to do a single sign-on. So if we go back to our scenario for a second, two different SharePoint websites, both configured for authentication to the authentication mechanism, which in this case would be a custom identity provider. When we access the first site, there's a process that takes place that validates and authenticates us. When we access the second site, if it's configured for authentication also, then the user goes through a very similar experience, but this time when it hits the identity provider, it doesn't then request a username and password sent back to us. It looks and says, I already have a token here, you're already authenticated, let's just pass that back through. So you have the same one. This requires a certificate trust. So what we end up with doing is, on the identity provider side, there'll be tokens, there'll be certificates used for encryption, there'll be certificates used for decryption, and there'll be certificates used for the actual signing of the traffic. Now, this certificate needs to be stored inside SharePoint and on the servers that SharePoint's using, so that when the tokens come back, that the STS inside SharePoint can then decrypt and use those certificates. It utilizes SAML 1.1 and WS Federation protocols, so this is good. So we're going to be standards-based. We're using the same tokens that other platforms use, such as Hotmail, Outlook.com, Yahoo, Gmail, Facebook. They all use a SAML-based federation protocol. And so our custom identifier will implement those same protocols. And then, of course, we need to use PowerShell to configure and to implement. We end up creating a new SP token security issuer that tells SharePoint I have a custom identifier that's SAML-based, and this is how we implement that into the platform. You will need custom components, potentially a custom welcome control, definitely the login mechanisms, but the beauty of the identifier is that all of these custom components, apart from a potential welcome control and claim provider, are stored in a completely different website. So they are not bound by the same rules of SharePoint. So if you're a SharePoint dev and you've been struggling with, well, I've got to make everything fit inside SharePoint, this is one of those times when it doesn't. You can use MVC code, you can do whatever you want to, as long as it supports and outputs the relative protocols that are needed, you can then use this. So let's kind of look at how this process works. I have my laptop and me, SharePoint, I have my website, which is my custom identifier, and then I have my provider authentication store. So there's an inherent trust that's built between those three components. The actual trust is configured between SharePoint and the custom identifier, and that's done via the SSL certificates that are stored between the two. That gives us that inherent trust. So it's not like anybody can come to the identifier and just magically authenticate and just try to pretend that they come from somewhere else. That inherent trust needs to be there, and it's based on a specific certificate. So if we go through the user process, the user makes the request for the web page. It's anonymous as always. We obtain the login page from the provider itself. The provider then requests a SAML security token by passing in the credentials, and then we validate the credentials with the identifier. So notice that nothing has connected really back to SharePoint yet, because remember, it's all client-side. So when I access the SharePoint infrastructure and say HTTPS SharePoint, SharePoint's going to say, hold on a minute, I need some authentication, and you configured a sign-in URL of HTTP external authentication.com, which is sent to my browser, and my browser is then redirected to that process. I then pass credentials, and then it goes through the process of generating a SAML security token that is then presented from the authentication store back to me as the client. My client then turns around and passes all of that off to SharePoint, where it creates a SharePoint security token and then sends me the resource that I'm getting. And so it's a little bit of a different process. Everything is done a little bit more client-side than actual server-side. We don't rely on the SharePoint infrastructure for the authentication process, which means that when we architect out a solution like this, that external authentication mechanism can reside anywhere. It could be another website on the SharePoint server. It could be another server. It could be something in a colo. It could be something in Windows Azure or Amazon or anywhere. It could just be a service in the cloud. So this brings great flexibility as we're looking at building them. Now, of course, Microsoft themselves brought this kind of idea to the table. They bought Azure Control Services, which if you've not played with that, this is kind of Microsoft's ADFS cloud service. So they have the on-premises product, which is Active Directory Federated Services, and they bolted that into the cloud. So they could then use that with Office 365 and with .NET code, etc. So this supports SAML 1.12 and now supports some of the 3 components. It will support Facebook, Google, Windows Live ID, Yahoo. It supports lots of these federated infrastructures. It can support a custom identifier. So for example, if you built your own and you want to federate into the cloud and then back again, you have the flexibility of tying all that together. It will support OpenID. any of those type authentication mechanisms. Once again, we have single sign-on using the browser and web application configuration. So our scenario was 2 websites. If we configure the 2 websites for authentication, and then we bounce to one of them and then come back, and the next time we bounce back, we'll just get a yes, we're authenticated, and throw us back. Now, the gotcha for all of these that we've been looking at is the single sign-on process. If the sites are configured for anonymous access, then you don't get the single sign-on bounce between the multiple sites. So that's where you would need to do custom components. So if we used Azure Control Services as the authentication stream, when I access the first site as anonymous and then click sign in, it's going to bounce me to the control services. I'm going to validate. It's going to bring me back. If I then click to go to a different SharePoint site that's also anonymous as well as authentication, it's not going to auto-sign me in. SharePoint doesn't perform that process. That's where we would need to custom build some of those components so that when we hit the other site, something in that process, which is where I said earlier that the welcome control is a great one for that, to add some extra logic that basically says, go and check if I'm authenticated, and if I am, perform the redirect and bring us back. The Azure Control Services requires a certificate trust, as before. We'll talk through that a little bit more momentarily, and it needs PowerShell configuration to actually implement inside the SharePoint infrastructure. And once again, you'll need the custom components, welcome controls, login mechanism, maybe you want changes to the Azure service, and then a custom claim provider. So how does this work? This one is a bit of a unique process that we have, and there's lots of other implementations like this that are now available outside of the Azure Control Service. So we have the same idea. We have the laptop, we have me, we have SharePoint, we have an external kind of website that's configured for the Azure Control Services, and then the Azure Control Services is connected to a bunch of providers. As you can see, we're using Twitter, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, LinkedIn, any number of those processes. And there's an inherent trust between all of these. There's a trust between SharePoint and Azure Services. There's a trust between the realm picker in Azure Services that needs to be presented, and then there's a trust between Azure Services and all of the other providers. So we have these certificates that run all the way through the system that are connected and trusted. So the process for the user is very similar to our previous one, that we request the web page, remember, anonymously is the first step. We're then sent to the Azure ACS provider picker, where we select the picker, and then once we've chosen what authentication mechanism, we're then redirected to the login page. So for this example, I'm going to use Twitter as the option. So I've gone to my SharePoint site, it's redirected me off box, Azure picker, which is the realm picker. You pick Twitter, it sends me off to Twitter. So think of that user experience for a second. I've typed in SharePoint in the browser. I've been redirected to ACS. I've clicked Twitter, it's redirected me to Twitter. So I've now gone through 2 redirects. I'm then redirected to the login page at the client side for the Twitter login process. I pass in my credentials, it's passed all the way back through the provider, back to ACS. The user, which is me, is authenticated and redirected to Azure ACS, where the SAML security token is wrapped up from the provider. Because remember, the SharePoint environment doesn't have a direct trust with Twitter. The trust that it has is with the Azure ACS. So you can almost imagine ACS as almost the broker of the tokens that come back. So once I've passed credentials, I've gone back to Twitter, it goes back to ACS, we wrap everything up, and then once it's been wrapped by the provider, the tokens are then validated with the STS in SharePoint. It's packaged up together as a security token. So you have a token from Twitter wrapped up by ACS, which is then wrapped into the authn token that's needed into SharePoint and then passed back with the user request. So you can see there's a whole process that takes place. Now if you did this, you can actually watch the process in Fiddler as it goes backwards and forwards and sees the redirect. Now of course the only downside to that is it's not like the Active Directory authentication process where the user doesn't really see those redirects. This one is very visible, the same as a custom identity provider, the same as ADFS would be. It's a very visible redirect process that goes backwards and forwards. So let's talk about authorization. Authentication was step one. Now the key is once you've authenticated, and this is one of the things that's often a misconception, is just because you're authenticated does not mean that you are authorized to access the SharePoint environment. And I know that may sound very simple, but we still get phone calls from clients, from their employees, that don't understand why they can't get access to SharePoint when they have authenticated to the infrastructure. And that's because authorization. Authorization is the verification of the permission that was granted to me when I went through the authentication process. So as I authenticate to, let's use Active Directory, remember that in the authentication process, I not only validate credentials, but I also, once upon validating, I'm returned a membership list at that point, which is my security groups. The security groups have been added to the SharePoint infrastructure and assigned permissions of full control or contribute or read. That is what is then verified. So I suppose your process flow is I open up the machine, I type in SharePoint, I go to the browser does the internal pushing of the information backwards and forwards to Active Directory, and then when the page, as we start to do the page load, there's a piece of SharePoint that then says, hold on a minute, I know that Liam's got an authent token, but hey, does he have an access control entry that says he can get in? And so that's the verification of the claim. Remember that authorization comes after authentication. It doesn't come the other way around. Now, however, there is a bit of a change. If you're, for example, doing blog comments anonymously, then technically everybody is authorized because there's no authentication that's required. And that's a configuration change that would require that. But authorization comes after auth. Active Directory is security groups for authorization. Membership and role provider, you will be validating roles for the authorization. Custom identity providers would be attributes and roles. Now, the question would be, what about if I assign a permission to an individual user? Then, firstly, I would kind of push to not do that so often, just because of things we talked about earlier. But then we are actually doing an authorization of a user object. The idea being that we would try to avoid an authorization of a specific user object, that we would look for some attribute or group or role that we can assign and validate the permissions to. Azure Control Services uses attributes or roles also, like the custom identity provider. Now, of course, one thing we can do is with the introduction of multi-factor authentication, which I all hope that you've looked at with all of these hack attempts that have gone on over these past year or so, it becomes more important now. And of course, having a RSA token or some other description or a PIN code or some extra flavor. I quite like the multi-factor authentication services that come with Windows Azure Services that you can bolt onto on-premise or you can use in the cloud that has that extra level of authentication. It's a way of authorizing who you are. Because remember that the authorization process that we're relying on in SharePoint is the fact that you've authenticated already and that you happen to have an attribute or a security group or a role associated to you. The extra level of multi-factor kind of sits in between those two. So as you authenticate and are validated, we then do an authorization to validate the authentication by requesting a PIN code or a security key of some description, a combination of numbers, or if you use the old phone factor, which is what's now in Windows Azure Services, it's going to ask you to type something into a text message or in an iPhone app or whatever it might be to pass that validation. That's not authorization to SharePoint. That's an authorization layer in between. So you've done authentication at the source. You've done authorization to prove that that is actually you. Because there was a picture that I saw the last time. I used it in a presentation that I gave at the SharePoint conference this past year, where it had a picture of a dog using a computer and a comment that would say, no one knows that I'm not a cat. And that's the kind of picture. No one does know who you really are. Just because you have an authentication token doesn't necessarily mean that you've been validated, because your accounts could have been compromised. So having a multi-factor in the place authorizes and validates that authentication token, and then we can rely on the normal process of attributes. So how does authentication work with multi-factor? So here we have the idea of me with a laptop and SharePoint and a whole bunch of other equipment in place. And the idea is that there's a trust, like always, and you'll notice this is something common, that there's a trust built between the SharePoint infrastructure and the authentication mechanism. Because once you get to the multi-factor process, we're going to be looking at a federated architecture. So this example would be using ADFS. So we have Active Directory, we have ADFS, and ADFS has the trust with SharePoint. So what's going to happen is the certificates are going to be trusted between the two platforms. I'm going to make the request, as always, as anonymous. That I obtain the login from the provider, which will actually send me over to ADFS. ADFS will either prompt me for authentication, or if I already have the realm provided, then it will know what the realm's going to be, and it will either pass my authentication token or it will just move on. I validate against the identifier. Then I obtain the second factor mechanism from the provider, and I present that back to the client. I then submit my second factor, which, let's say it's a biometric fingerprint scan, something cool like that. I pass those all the way across, and then I submit those straight to the multi-factor provider. The multi-factor provider will then validate those tokens. It will send all the way back through ADFS back to SharePoint a security token, which then gets wrapped up in all. And this is a great process. And this is very secure, because if you're using something like a text message or something like an app on a phone device or something else, or maybe you're using the Microsoft ADFS version 3 or whatever, where you can do device as your second factor, then that means there's no way for anybody to kind of intercept that process. The fact that I store your credentials is great as a hacker, but that doesn't really help me when I try to authenticate. It then says, I'm sorry, but your device is not registered as a second factor, or you need to have a text message and reply with a specific code, or you need to use the RSA token. So multi-factor authentication is now becoming commonplace, and I would expect to see lots more SharePoint implementations using multi-factor authentication, because SharePoint can be susceptible to hack attempts and people being able to access data that they shouldn't be able to see. So authentication and authorization. So what kind of the questions that we should be asking? Well, for authentication, we should be asking, where are the users coming from? Do we want to store credentials for them? And how are they actually going to authenticate? Now, we outlined a few different options that we can use for authentication. Everything from an identifier to an external federation platform, to membership and role providers, all the way through to regular Active Directory. These are questions that we now need to ask. For authorization questions, we should be saying, should we use security groups, roles, or attributes for authorization? Because they are very different. They kind of perform the same process, but depending on the authentication answers, will determine the authorization process. Do we require multi-factor? And I'm almost at the point where it's becoming a de facto standard that really we should have multi-factor authentication now. So let's have a look at the login process in kind of the real world. So I'm just going to move my server over to that window. So everybody should be able to see that now. So I'm inside my SharePoint environment, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to access my SharePoint site. I have a box on here called portal.sps.int, and of course I've booted my VM up recently, so of course it's going to take a couple of seconds for the site to load. But what should happen as we go through that process, while I'm talking, I'll actually load the other ones in the background. See if that one loads. Let me just go back to my web applications, just make sure we're all here. So I have a few sites that I want to load in the background so we can kind of see this process. So what you'll see is I've got my SharePoint site 2013. It's anonymous. So I click sign in, and then what's going to happen is you'll see it instantly logged me in. And that's because I'm on an Active Directory system right here. So if I go in, and I don't think I installed Fiddler. I'll set that up for later so we can see the other one. But you'll see that it simply took place. It logged me as administrator. If I actually go to the permissions of the site and look for people and groups, what you'll see is owners. You'll see that my administrator account is here, and I can click on the administrator account. I just want to show you, because it's something we're going to talk about momentarily, is that I assigned my permission to an individual user. Now, I don't have lots of groups here, so I just assigned the administrator account. But what I did do is make sure that the account resides inside one of the SharePoint site groups, that I didn't just add an individual user and assign permissions to that one. Now, if I was going to load a membership and role provider, let me just load the other one too. Let me just get the other URL. I want to do this, leave that going in the background. Now, when I went to my other site, this time I was presented with a realm picker. Now, obviously, this is not the most exciting way to have people log in, but this allows me to pick how I would like to authenticate into the platform. So I have Windows authentication and forms. Now, if we go back to Central Admin and click on my portal site and click on Authentication Providers and click in the default zone, you'll see that I have Anonymous enabled. And if I go down to here, I have just Windows authentication enabled. I can have others, but I don't have those enabled right now. If I pick my Forms one and do the same process, you'll see once again I have Anonymous, which is why we get stopped at that point. But then I also have Windows authentication, excuse me, and forms-based authentication. And I have two pieces. I have a membership provider called MP and a role provider called RP, because I'm that creative when it comes to names. So that's why we get this realm picker presented to us, because I have configured the web application to use dual authentication mechanisms. If I was to click Windows Auth, I would get the same experience as if I came here to my SharePoint site. It would just automatically log me in. But I'm actually going to choose Forms, and this will redirect me to the internal page. You'll see that what it actually does is it goes to _forms. So let me go to IIS, open up Forms, open up my Forms website, and you'll see that Forms is actually a virtual directory. And it basically has a default page and a web config of its own. And if I click Explore, you'll see that it's actually just a directory that's created underneath the actual IIS website. So, and it presents that username and password box and then ties everything together. So I'm going to put my username in. Hopefully I've got my password right. I'm going to click Sign In. And what this is going to do, this is going to go ahead and validate me against my SQL. So I'm going to open up the SQL database. Let me just refresh to make sure my database is show. Wait for that to load. And you'll see that I actually have a database here. And if I go to Users and just select top 1,000 users, you'll see that my user account Cleary is here, and this is listed in the system. And I'm authenticating against this. And you'll see that I'm logged in now. And I'm logged in right here. And of course, I have some other options that are available for changing passwords, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, if I go back to Site Settings and go to People and Groups, and if I go to Owners, or any of these, I can go to Site Collection Administrator, you'll see that my Windows accounts show up. But if I go to my Site Settings and do Site Collection Administrators, you'll see that my Cleary account shows up here. And that's the account from the forms-based provider. Now, what I did also is I implemented, you can go and get this yourself, but I actually went in and downloaded an FBA User Manager. So if I go to FBA User Management, and you'll see that I can actually go and create users. I can click on a user at this point, and I can edit information. I can check what roles they belong to. And this is one of those ones that is available on Codeplex. You can go ahead and get that one. I can do the role management too. But what's really happening is it's putting information into the ASP.NET membership and role provider authentication mechanism, which can be configured using ASP.NET Reg SQL from .NET, and it creates that user kind of roles. So for example, I can click New User. I could go through and put the information I want to, assign the permissions. I can send them an email address. Then I would be able to log out and log back in as that individual. Now, if you didn't have this process, then what you can do is, if I go back here, is I've created a .NET website just called Accounts. And what I actually did is if I go to providers, I configured my website to talk to the membership and role provider. And what that means is that when I want to add users, I can actually use the IIS infrastructure to pick those individuals. So if I go to .NET users, you'll see that that Cleary account is there. I can click add, and I get to use the .NET infrastructure to go ahead and add individuals. So if I go in and say John, so if I go in and say J Smith, for example, and do J Smith at SPS.end, and I do a regular base password and do it this way, then I can click next. I can assign the role that I would like to have. I can click finish. Now I added that individual, and what you should now see is when we execute this, my account shows up here, and more importantly, when I go back to my site settings and do user management, that account also shows up. So you can see there's a one-to-one mapping between those accounts that we use, and that's great. Now what about if I wanted to use something that was outside of that infrastructure, and I wanted to use an identity provider? So I have another site here, and this one's configured for Windows authentication and a custom identity provider. So if I go back to this one and do authentication mechanisms, what you'll see is we have anonymous, and we also have Windows, and then we have this section here. And this section becomes available when you've implemented a custom identity provider. So I'm now going to launch my SharePoint PowerShell window, and what I'm actually going to do is run a command that says get SP Trusted Identity Token Issuer. Let me just expand that. And what you'll see is I have the details of this. So I have a URL, which is https idp.sp blah, blah, blah. It tells me the claims I'm using, which is going to be an email address claim and then a role claim. And then I also have the certificate that's being used, and it's configured directly into SharePoint. Now, that's configured more so if I go to security and do manage trusts. You'll see that my certificate, which is right here, is configured in the platform also. So there's a one-to-one mapping between my custom identity provider and the certificate. In my IIS website, I actually have the identity provider configured, so I can click Browse, and if I just go to that wasn't the site that I wanted to load. I actually wanted to load IDP, sorry, and click this one. This will then take me and load that custom identity management page that's configured, so we'll leave that to go. And I'm using the ThinkTexture one. If you've not seen this one, this is fantastic. This could be anything. But the most important thing here is that I can sign in. And I'm going to sign into here, log into the platform. And if I have my password right, then I can go to administration of my ThinkTexture, and I can create roles. It comes with 2 roles, but I can create new ones. And it also comes with users. So I can create specific users. I created one called Cleary. I have an administrator one. So we have some user management that's being handled inside the ThinkTexture process. But what I can do here is go in and choose that authentication. And notice what happened. It instantly redirected me to the ThinkTexture identity provider. Now this could be anything. This could be Windows Azure Services. This could be Azure Active Directory Services. This could be Office 365. This could be any number of providers that you have configured. And then what I'm able to do at this point, so I could do Cleary again and log in, and if I've got my password right, it should do an authentication. It will do a redirect sign in, and then hopefully if it works, it'll redirect back to SharePoint, and I should be authenticated directly into the SharePoint platform. Now what took place is it went to this process, it went and authenticated me, and there we go, I'm now logged in via that email address. And if I go now to site content, I'm not in as administrator, so I don't get administrator, but you'll see that I get access to the SharePoint site as a regular user. And I actually validated using a username, which was actually stored in a custom identity provider. Now, one of the things that SharePoint does bring to the table, which we're going to talk about in a second, is the idea of claims. So I'm just going to click a couple of pages here. And when a user is authenticated into the platform, there's a series of claims that get presented. So I'm just going to pick one of them for now because we are going to come back to this. But I wanted to just show very quickly that when we're using claims authentication, there's a whole selection of claims that come through. And I just wanted to show you that, but we'll actually come back and talk about that momentarily. So let's go back to the slide deck. And let's talk about claims. So claims were introduced really in SharePoint 2010. And in 2010, the claims were introduced. And the reason they were introduced is because we need to do wide support for federated authentication mechanisms. And so it's because they're standards-based. WS Federation, WS Trust, and SAML authentication. It had been around for quite some time, but SharePoint really wasn't the platform that enabled us to use this. It has inherent single sign-on. That was one of the reasons why it was built, because if you have two sites requiring authentication, the single sign-on process just flips between them, and once I have a token, then I can get to the other side. Obviously, the gotcha was going to be the SSO if you were anonymous access. And federation, really for this one, was most third-party providers already supported these protocols, and SharePoint was kind of lagging behind. This is now the Microsoft standard. If any of you have Office 365 or Windows Azure Services, you'll know that you're using this kind of authentication process to get in. It's actually quite interesting to go to an Office 365 portal. So you type in your browser and say Office 365, and when you get to that point, it redirects you to a provider. You pick whether it's a Microsoft account or something else, and then it redirects you again, and then you put the credentials in, and then it redirects you all the way back again. So this is now the standard approach that's being used. And this was really done so we could have less custom coding built into SharePoint. And I kind of have to specify that one. It doesn't mean less custom coding altogether. It just means less coding that is tied intrinsically to the SharePoint stack. So let's talk about claim terminology. So let's talk about the first thing, identity. This is kind of the new piece of claim. This is really the info, the person, or the object at this point. So if we're using the driving license as the example, because what I wanted to do is try to kind of emphasize that we use these terminologies on a daily basis. We just don't know them as that. So for example, on a Virginia driving license, the name would be the identity of the individual. The claim would be the attributes of that individual or identity. So you'll see on the driving license we have what sex we are, the eye color, the height, things like that. Those would be termed as attributes in the claim token. And that's where we would look at authorization. So the identity is the authentication. The claim, the attributes are the authorization vehicle. Then we have the token. The token is basically everything wrapped together. So when we go through the process, and we saw in the process flows that it has an authentication piece, then we validate, then we get a token, and we get attributes, and we wrap them into an auth token, then what it does is it's the binary representation of the identity, the set of claims and the certificate signatures put together. Then we have the relying party, which is the access point that we're trying to get to. So in my example we did earlier, that was the SharePoint site that we're trying to get to. So you have the relying party, which is SharePoint, and then we have the secure token service, which is the issuer. Now, I'm not talking about the SharePoint STS. Custom identity provider process would be the secure token service. Any other authentication process, then the SharePoint one is the STS. In our driving license world, that would be the DMV. The DMV would be the issuer of that piece of identity and token attributes. So if we just flick back, because we started talking about the claims viewer web part. So this is the web part that I wrote some time ago. But what this allows me to do is for me to look at the claims that are being presented back. So let's have a look at the Active Directory one to begin with. The first thing we notice is that we get the name identifier, which is the actual account that we used. I then get the user principal name because it's Active Directory, the login name, I get the user ID, and notice that we get this little format, and we'll talk about that. More importantly, we get the identity provider mechanism that's been presented. And you'll see a one-to-one mapping here. This right here is prefixed with a W. That's because it's represented by the Windows. And then, of course, you can see the name issuer, which is just confirming that it's actually Active Directory. And then we can skip down, and you'll see that we have the group SIDs, and these are the Active Directory security groups that I'm a member of. Now, of course, that doesn't help me because I don't know the SID for the security groups. But what that means is that SharePoint understands them. We also get the names back for the name resolution of the people picker. And if we skip right down, we see that the certificate token that was used for signing, and we can actually expand and look at the raw SAML token itself. And this is quite interesting to look at because this helps us understand that the token that gets passed is purely a piece of XML. It tells me the authentication link that was used, and then more importantly, it tells us what the primary attributes are. And as we skip down, it'll then start to open up. We'll see all of the attributes that we support, and you'll also start to see the X509 certificate that's being passed, the signature that's being passed for those certificates, and then you'll see the signature of the certificate. So this really, when you look at it, I mean, think how much more secure the authentication mechanism is now that we have a secure token service in the middle. And this is just Active Directory. This is using the internal STS for SharePoint. We're wrapping everything up in an X509 certificate, which is nice and secure, and so we're then not able to break into that. So how does that look for a membership and role provider? So I have the same thing again, and if I then break this down, what we'll now see is if I just scroll across here, you'll see it's a little bit shorter, but we get the name, we get the roles that we are associated to, I get my login name, and notice I get a different prefix this time. The identity provider, remember there's a one-to-one mapping, so where it says forms and then says MP, which is the membership provider, the F is represented right here. So 0# period F. F represents forms at that point. And then, of course, we can go down and break out the whole thing again and have a look at that. Now, for a custom identity provider, let me just minimize this back. We have the same process, but this time we get something a little bit different. We get the unique identifier. Remember, we looked at the PowerShell. If I go back to my PowerShell window, it tells me what the unique identifiers are, which is actually email address, and then passes the role. These are the claim types. So the two identifiers that are available is email address, which is name, and this one. So there's a one-to-one mapping. Then we also get this, which is 05.t. T represents the identifier of trusted, which is where the T comes from. And then we can expand and see the same certificates and everything else. So it's very much the same process. We can see the claims. And of course, in the claim providers that we write, in the custom code that we write, we're able to interrogate any of these claims and use these for providing permissions. So if I go back to the Active Directory one and do site settings and look at people and groups, I can go to owners, and if I wanted to add a user, I can look for a service, account of some description, and you'll see that it instantly goes and finds those. It just finds them straight away. So I can click Visio, and it finds those accounts because we're doing a live lookup against those individuals. Now, if I go back and do this here in my membership and role provider and do people and groups and do new user, what I should be able to do is do JS Smith, and you'll see it finds that. I should be able to do Cleary, and it should find those, and it recognizes those. Now, if I just type anything, it's not going to do that because the membership and role provider is doing a live lookup against the database to do that. Now, what I'm actually going to have to do is if I was going to do this here, I don't actually have permission, so let me, I won't change permissions here, but I'll go back here. In the custom identity provider, I have these two accounts to assign permissions. Now, if I go back to here, let me just see if I can add permission to my account while I'm doing this in front of you. So if I do identifier, user policy, I do add user, and if I do Cleary, let's see which account this comes up. Now you'll notice I type in the email address of the person I'm looking for, and it brings me two options in the people picker. And this is an inherent problem with identity providers, that the people picker doesn't know how to resolve. I mean, in actual fact, I could put the word cheese right here and do this, and notice I would still get 2 sets of cheese, even though they don't exist, because the people picker for a custom identifier will resolve anything. It will say it's a valid account. So if I pick that, that tells me that account exists. But the thing to understand is it's not actually an account. It's just a piece of text that just happens to come up that we've told it to validate. So if in your authentication process you were looking at different types of shoes that people wore and you had that as a claim, then I would be able to authenticate somebody against the term red shoes. And this is the email claim. Now if I go back and type red shoes again and do this and pick the other one, now what I get is I get email and I get role. None of those exist. So we need to be careful when we look at these people picker processes for custom identifiers that we need to fix this by building a custom identifier, because it will support anything that you type. So the formats for those, you'll see we've listed them here. So I would represent an identity claim. Then we have user login and all those different things. So let's look at an example. So for a Windows account that's added to the domain, so I'm talking Active Directory, Active Directory claims authentication. When the user account is added, we would get this inside SharePoint. It would be prefixed with I, and then it would be 0. So if we break this down, we're going to have I for identity, 0 is the reserved one. Then we're also going to have hash, which would be, this is a user login name. The period means it's a string value, and then W represents Windows. We can go through the same and look for all these different types and map them to what we want them to be. So SharePoint has a way of putting these accounts into there. Now, if you're not using claims right now, and then you migrate to claims, then you'll need to migrate the user accounts. So, for example, a regular Windows authentication that's in default mode, not using claims, you would just see domain/user. But when you go to claims, this then gets migrated over, and you end up with that. And when you're building your membership and role providers, you'll need to cater for the fact that you now have a claim token like this one at the beginning of the membership and role provider. So this does change the way that we configure things, the code that we use, and the way that users are interpreted inside the SharePoint infrastructure. So one of the things that claims brought to the table was the ability to augment the claims. So claims augmentation is all about intercepting the claims at the point of authentication and transforming those into something else. So for example, let's say you authenticate against an Oracle platform and the identity claim is called UID, for example. When it comes into SharePoint, we actually want that to be mapped to name identifier or something else. So we have the ability to do claims augmentation that says map this attribute to this attribute on the way in and out. We can also add additional attributes. So think of the historical way that we would do this. You would write some custom logic that when you authenticated to SharePoint, that you would have some code that would say, oh, hey, Liam's authenticated now. Now go and query this back-end application and get me these extra fields of information from, from the human resources application or some line of business application. Now we don't have to do that. If we intercept at the point of claims augmentation, at the point of authorization, we can get that information at the authentication process point. So we can go and retrieve other attributes from line of business data before we get back to the SharePoint environment. So the idea behind this being, let's take ADFS, for example. We go into ADFS, we authenticate. Inside ADFS, we write a custom attribute store, which is a custom DLL, that goes and says, hey, when Liam authenticates, take his unique identifier, look up in this Oracle database, grab some extra attributes that are human resources flags, bring them back, attach them as SAML attributes, and then package and sign all of that and send that back to SharePoint. That would mean that when we look at the claim attributes in the claim viewer web part, we would see all of those values. Now, there are different types of augmentation. If we're using a federation gateway, so something like Azure ACS or ADFS, we can do mapping of attributes there and then. So the beauty of that is that we just configure SharePoint to expect A, B, and C, and we do all of the mapping out in the cloud somewhere or in that other platform. Now, inside SharePoint itself, we can do claim mapping also. So when we actually register the identity provider using PowerShell, we have the ability to go in and say, this is the attribute coming in, and I want to make SharePoint see that as something else. Or we can append attributes. So think of that for a second. We have something coming from Twitter that is expecting to be in this format. It goes to ACS. We retransform it. We add the PowerShell to add that to SharePoint, and then we remap it again. So what could actually happen is a claim attribute could have been changed 2 or 3 times before it gets to SharePoint, which is what we actually want it to do. So this gives us great flexibility in building a solution. We're a little bit early. Before we have the break, let's go back over to here, and let's go back to our infrastructure for a second. And what I wanted to do is if we look inside the SharePoint syntax. So when I wanted to add my identity provider, I'm using a piece of custom code. I'm just going to make this there, and I'll make this a little bit bigger. Let me just change this and make that 14. So this piece of PowerShell right here allows me to register my custom identity provider, and there's a couple of lines that I want to pick out for you. So the first thing we're going to look at is I'm actually going in and specifying the realm. I'm specifying the URL that I want to associate it to and the URL for authentication. This piece right here is some custom code that's basically querying the metadata, the federation metadata. So if I go back to my browser, and if I go back to here, if I go to my identity provider, which is obviously over here, and I go to the home page and click Federation Metadata, this is what we're talking about. An external identity provider has an XML document that describes how we authenticate attributes and things like that. So in my PowerShell, I'm connecting to this right here, and I'm actually getting this the X509 certificate that we need to use, and I'm configuring that as a trusted root authority directly into SharePoint. Now, the 2 most important things, the actual claims that we want to use. So I'm using this schema, so email address and role, and these are my claims that are coming in, and then I'm mapping the display names to email, and then I've told them to be the same. Now this is at the point where I can do claims augmentation that will say, I don't want it to be that when it hits SharePoint, I want it to be claims-email instead. So I can do augmentation there and then. That won't change the identity provider. The identity provider will still present that back to me, but SharePoint will then swap that out to what I need that to be. And then, of course, more importantly, I have SP, Trusted Identity Token Issuer, and then I pass the right names, and I tell it that number 1, which is my email address, is my unique identifier. Now, if we were doing that differently, let's say that we were doing it to Windows Azure Services. Let me just increase the size of this to 14, and then we'll word wrap. I have the same process here. This time I'm connected to my Azure Control Service, which is using v2.ws Federation. I'm then getting my certificate, which I created myself here, which has been loaded to my Azure Control Service. I'm creating that trusted root certificate. And then I do the same thing. And notice we have a slight change here. So I'm taking the email address claim like we did before. I'm mapping it to email, and then I'm keeping it as that. So SharePoint will see that as a claim. On the second one, I want to support Windows Live authentication. So I need to use name identifier, but I know that I can't map name identifier directly into SharePoint because that's actually a reserved claim, and I can't modify that. So what I'm going to do is pass that back. I'm going to call it UPN because technically it's a user principal name that comes back from Windows Live, and then I'm going to convert it to a local type. And the local type is this, claims UPN. So what that now means is by me registering the Azure ACS components, I've now just registered that and done claims augmentation at the point of configuration. So there's those three options. If I go back to my custom identity provider mechanism, which is here, and go to administration, what we'll see is I have lists of identity providers, relying parties that I can configure, and I have all of the configuration that I'm allowed to use, certificates. If I go to the general configuration, you'll see that I have all of this information that I can configure for this. These are all the options that I have, and I can go through and make changes to what token base is being used. So I can perform mappings here, and then I go all the way down back to my code, and I can perform mappings here. Now what that means is that if I go back to my claims, that what I actually get is these claims. So you'll see that my identity provider claim is right here, my user ID, my name identifier, which is this one, maps exactly to the one in the identifier. If I go back to my membership and role provider and do the same thing and expand, you'll see that these name identifier, these will map exactly to the ones that I configured in my membership and role provider and also in the PowerShell commands that I use to run those things. So claims augmentation, whether you think you need it or not, you will actually perform some of that by doing the PowerShell implementation and connecting everything together. So that kind of gives us an idea. Now, how about the connecting of everything together? So for Active Directory, so if I go to my regular portal site, and if I just open up my regular one, and if I just scroll down to providers, oh, my Visual Studio is playing catch-up. Let me go down a bit more. You'll see here that we have my providers. And by default, SharePoint gives us an I and a C. And these are the base membership and role providers that are built by SharePoint. Basically, this is to support claims because the name I, as you can imagine, there's a one-to-one mapping between the I and the I in the claims prefix, and then C for the groups. Now, for regular Active Directory, there's no other configuration that's needed at this point. But if we go to our Forms one and do the same thing and open in Visual Studio, and if I just scroll down to, if I just do providers and go right down, what you'll now see is we have our list of providers right here, and we have a second one that's underneath, and there's my MP provider that sits right there. So I'll tell you what, let me just make that 200 so I can scroll down a little bit. I think I went too far. So if we scroll across, you'll see I have my connection string, which if I went to the connection string, you would see a database connection, and the role provider, and the membership role provider and the membership provider right here. If I scroll across, you'll see that they're inheriting from the SQL membership provider and the SQL role provider, the .NET 4 versions. And that's all it has to do. I've configured that there. SharePoint now adheres to that because of the .NET configuration that's available. Now, what about if we go to a custom identity provider, and if I do the same process, open with Visual Studio, let me just increase the size, 200, and we'll do providers again. Let me just scroll down. Notice that there are no changes that are made. So when you're looking at choosing an authentication mechanism, that when you build something like a membership and role provider, you're now impacting lots and lots of configuration changes that will need to be made. In fact, if I go to the SharePoint services sitting right here, and if I just explore the web services and go to security token and look at the web config sitting right here, you'll see, we'll just increase the size so we can see that a little bit better. If we go into the providers, you'll see that for the membership and role provider, I need to make changes to the secure store to get this to work. I have the same connection strings and the same connection. And then I also, if I happen to go to Central Administration and look at the web config again, and if I just increase the size of that again, and do providers, you'll see yet again in central administration I also have to add the same thing. So this is one thing to remember. One of the key things and the reasons why federated infrastructure was put into place and security was to get away from making changes like this. You all know, or you may not know, that for Office 365 you don't have this flexibility. And the reason for that is because this code is running more or less at the full trust level inside SharePoint. So the idea is to move away from an abstracted one to this, which is a clean web config, and your authentication is done in central administration and PowerShell, and everything is just offloaded to where it should go. So that kind of gives you an idea of the configuration that's required to put those pieces together. Not only do we need to deploy solutions, we need to deploy code components, we need to deploy custom components, we need to make changes to web configs, but as soon as you move to an authentication that's offloaded somewhere else, then we're able to work a little bit better and not make those changes to core infrastructure of SharePoint. Because I suppose the key would be that we want to make sure that we don't make fundamental changes to the SharePoint environment which ultimately could impact performance. So we'll leave it there. It's 2:20, so we'll come back at 2:30 and carry on. So take a 10-minute break, and we shall see you momentarily. Welcome back. It's 2:30, so let's get moving again. And we'll go from 2:30 till about 10 minutes before the end, so about 3:50, and then if there's any questions, then we'll answer those questions at that point. So if you do have questions, feel free to post them in there. I won't be able to answer them as we go through, but as we come towards the end, then we'll take the last 10 minutes or so to actually go answer those questions. Okay, so let me just sort my machine out ready for you. Okay, so let's get started again. So let's talk about SharePoint on-premise versus online, because this never used to be a conversation, but now it is a conversation that is actually becoming a bit more significant now, whether we use on-premise or whether we use cloud. So on-premise, and we're going to talk about authentication as far as this goes. On-premise, we would be using Active Directory, membership and role providers, maybe custom identifiers, maybe ADFS, and for an on-premise, and what I mean by on-premise is that you actually have physical access to the servers, and so customizations can be made to the SharePoint authentication stack. So this is you deploying a WSP file, that would have membership and role providers or claim providers. So this is one thing that we did talk about, that claim providers are basically full trust code. So if you're on-premise, you're able to deploy that as long as you own the infrastructure. It's not like it's a sandbox solution or anything else like that. So for on-premise, you have a lot more flexibility than you would. Now, when you go to online, then it becomes very, very more complicated. Because if we're talking Office 365, then we could be using Windows Azure Active Directory, and this would be tenant-specific. So that's where you can utilize the ACS components that we talked about. We can use custom identifiers to a certain degree. It's only been recently that Office 365, for example, has allowed you the ability to swap out what would be the regular authentication mechanism to something else. There's some great posts online for a couple of people that I know that have wrote some. And this is the big one. Customizations cannot be made to the SharePoint authentication stack. On Office 365, you're not going to be able to deploy a claim provider. You're not going to be able to deploy a custom login control. You're not going to have that flexibility. So when we're talking on-premise and online, and when I talk about online, I also include maybe you're hosting something at a colo, or you have a purchase service, something like an FP Web or a Rackspace, where you have a dedicated SharePoint infrastructure provided and given to you from those providers. You may not have this access either. So you're almost at the point where when moving to an online cloud version, that you're down to using identity providers. And you know what? For me, that's great, because I'm a great advocate of identity provider mechanisms rather than building something that needs to be deployed specifically inside SharePoint that runs at the point of just-in-time and everything else like that. So I'm a great component of that. So how does that process work? So let's talk about Windows Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory, as you may or may not know, is Microsoft's answer to putting Active Directory in the cloud for you. So if you purchase Office 365, you get an Azure tenant, you get your Active Directory instance that's actually connected, and then you can synchronize your on-premise Active Directory back out to Azure AD and vice versa. So as with most things, there's a trust, and the trust is built with certificates all the way through. So SharePoint has the trust up to Azure. Azure has the trust to Azure Active Directory. And this is where we're going to utilize the ACS components, because an Azure Active Directory instance can be connected to the ACS and then utilized for authentication. So we go through the process. We request a web page again. We send to the Azure ACS provider. It's then sent all the way to the Azure tenant login, which is provided by the Office 365 infrastructure. And then we redirect it to the login page. We pass the credentials. Obviously, the Azure Active Directory doesn't just authenticate us. We have to pass something in there. We send credentials to a provider. We then authenticated, we go back through the Azure ACS, and then the SAML token is wrapped. And then, of course, we get the same ending process as it would normally. All we've done differently is we've utilized the Azure components, and we're now using an Active Directory in the cloud that we can then federate with our own Active Directory on our infrastructure. So moving to a cloud architecture, specifically thinking of Office 365, because that's one of the most viable options right now, is that you still have the flexibility of utilizing the same infrastructure that you would have for your on-premise for the cloud. And this kind of brings us into that hybrid scenario where you would potentially maybe have on-premise intranet, and then you want to move your extranet into the cloud. You can now use the same authentication mechanism between the two. So let's just recap on authentication and authorization. Authentication is the first step in security for SharePoint. This is a big one. SharePoint only understands what you set. And I know it sounds funny, but SharePoint's not smart enough to circumvent incorrect configuration. If you configure it badly, SharePoint just does what you tell it. I wish my kids were like that, but that's not how that works. My kids are smart enough to circumvent the things that I ask them to do, but SharePoint's not. It will do exactly what you tell it. If you give all the users full control, they've got full control. SharePoint won't look at it and go, don't think you guys should have full control. It will just carry on. Authentication can and should be offloaded where it's supposed to go. It should be offloaded. I'm not saying you have to, but it should be offloaded. Authorization should be done by security group or attribute where possible, and I'm not saying you have to do this the whole time. Where possible, you should not be assigning permissions to individual users. In fact, one of the things that we've found that is quite helpful is if we are using security groups and then we decide to break permission on a document library and only want 3 people to have access, then in actual fact, unless the names and the titles of the documents are sensitive, and depending on the number of individuals, we may be able to just break a site group, have a new site group, put the individual users in, and then add them to that. Or we may be able to implement something like rights management, which means that they can see the content, but they can't do anything with it unless they have a rights management policy associated to them. Utilized federated architecture. I can't emphasize this enough. A federated infrastructure will give you greater flexibility in authentication processes, in federating with other applications. It will give you a greater process for the future, because realistically, whether you're on-prem or not on-prem, you're going to be ending up using some kind of federated architecture. We've actually had quite a few clients recently where when they're building their SharePoint infrastructures, that they no longer want to use regular Active Directory. They would like to use ADFS of some type because they want to be able to federate with other applications in the organization. And so they can have a single process to authenticate to multiple applications. Do not be the username and password authority. This is up to you. But for me, in this day and age where everybody seems to be hacked and passwords and usernames keep being compromised, I wouldn't want to own that. I wouldn't want to have that username and password piece in my infrastructure. If it's for internal employees only, of course you do. But if you're building something that's external, you're building an extranet, why do you want the onus of looking after those accounts and managing those permissions and making sure that the passwords are encrypted and that you're using the highest strength SSL, that you're doing all kinds of different things? Look at using a provider service, looking at using some other mechanism to do that. And there's no excuses to not use claims anymore. In all fairness, lots of the issues that we had in 2010 when claims got introduced and things didn't work, they've been ironed out come 2013. And by using other technology, we're able to use claims with all kinds of things. If you're using ADFS, then you should be looking at using ADFS 3, which comes in Windows Server 2012 R2, and then maybe combine that with the Web Application Firewall, which is now effectively the mini replacement for User Access Gateway and TMG, which comes on Windows Server 2012 R2. And we should be looking at using those together to give us offloaded authentication, and ADFS 3 will actually allow us to support custom apps also, which right now, if you deploy a custom app into an ADFS environment, you won't be able to authenticate correctly for those apps. But using ADFS3 and the web application firewall, we're able to do some configuration that will let that work. So that was step number 1. And that's great. You've figured out how to get your users in. You know how to authenticate them. Now let's go down the stack a little bit. Let's authenticate against the infrastructure. So let's talk about pros of SharePoint first. Whether you believe it or not, SharePoint was built with security by design. And the reason it's built by that way is because there's a default deny. It's us that changes it. There's a logical topology. There's separate data access layers and access controls. It's built in the way that you would kind of expect an application to be built. Now, the developers out there will probably say, well, I could build something a little bit better, and that's cool, and I would say more power to you. But SharePoint does pretty well. And with a deny of default, the only time it doesn't be secure is when we stop messing with it and changing it and moving permissions around. So we need to come to kind of accept that. The cons on it really is that there are too many entry points. SharePoint's a big boy. It's no longer site server or index server or pre-SharePoint portal server 2001 or team services where there was hardly anything. It's a beast of a product with 1 million entry points. It potentially could be vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. We could potentially perform brute force password attacks using just regular software that you can download. Definitely has been vulnerable to cross-site scripting. But the most important thing is it's built on Windows and it uses .NET. And so any of those vulnerabilities can and do affect SharePoint. And that's one thing that I think everybody tends to forget, that that's really the kind of the crux of looking after SharePoint at that point, is when it comes to securing SharePoint and making sure that it's got the right patches on it and everything else, is that when there's a patch that comes out for SharePoint, unless we have a specific reason why we shouldn't put it on, we should be putting the security patches on because they help to fix some of the issues that are there. So let me just drag across for a second here. And I want to show you a website here which is called CVE Details, which basically gives you the data source for all them. And I've done a quick search for SharePoint. And if you'll see, let's start at the top for a second. So there's only a few. See how many there were? And that was just page 1. And these are specific details that have been written to do with Office or to do with SharePoint. So for example, take number 1. So if we do 2014-1761, this is one that's been around for a while, but you'll see that it has some information. But look at what it's affecting. It will affect SharePoint Server 2013, 2010 Server Pack 1, 2010 Service Pack 2, Office Web App 2013, 2010, etc., etc. And this is an important one. These are all about denial of service execution code and buffer overflows. But there's lots of these. So use this site. CV Details is an important site to go to. There's a few others, but you'll be able to come through and look at how bad some of these are. That one there is a 9.3. That's a severe one. And of course, Microsoft is doing better at releasing patches, and it releases them quite frequently. So that's CVE Details as a site. So what makes me nervous about SharePoint? It's SharePoint likes to talk a lot, probably like me. I like to talk a lot. But SharePoint talks even more than I do. And that's saying something. It probably talks as much as my daughter does, who talks unbelievably. But look at the ports that it has open. So we've got 80 and 443, so HTTP and SSL. Then we're going to drop over to these random ports that sit up on the 22,000s. Then we've got regular kind of 389 and 464, and we've got UDP, and we've got DNS, and we've got all kinds of different ports that come up. SharePoint talks on every single layer, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And that is a problem. And that's a problem because what do you tend to do? Well, when you want to build a secure infrastructure, the first thing you should do is go through and figure out the ports that are being used. And you look at the servers and say, oh, I'll just block out what ports can go between the servers. And then what do you find out? You find out that SharePoint doesn't work because you put firewalls between everything, and it's now blocking communication that SharePoint actually relies on. So what do we do instead? We then have to open up holes in the firewall to make it work, which then kind of beats the whole point of a secure infrastructure. So let's look at that design. So let's look at some of the topologies that we have. So we have the fault-tolerant farm. This is one that we see a lot, and it basically has web servers, application servers, and database servers. Very straightforward design. Seems to be quite common in most infrastructures. From a security perspective, it's great. We may decide to put firewalls in between the layers, but everything is segmented, and that's key number one. When we're building an infrastructure, we've got to look at segmenting the layers in the infrastructure. We could then make this optimized for search. Search becomes really important. It really is one of the big features of 2013. We should be looking at creating dedicated environments, dedicated servers, for the querying and indexing. Because remember that the idea is that we're trying to limit the surface area of attack. If we stick everything onto the same servers, your surface area attack is massive. If we start to break out, then we've just reduced that service area attack to individual and isolated servers. So that makes it much more complicated when, for example, somebody wants to perform a security break against the environment. There's lots more to kind of look for. Of course, we have distributed cache farms. Obviously, this is new to 2013. This is where we want to have separate servers to handle not only the querying, different application servers, but also servers that handle the distributed cache servers, which will run across the web servers for. And that's important because the authentication tokens are stored in those distributed cache. Then we may introduce Office web apps. Now just hold on for a second. Wait a minute. We've got web servers, we've got application servers, we've got index servers, we've got database servers, we've got distributed cache running, and then we're going to add more servers. We're adding Office web app servers. So hold on a minute. That means my surface area, even though it's isolated, has become a little bit bigger because now I have to worry about all of those different layers. So what can we then do? Well, we could use request management and load balancing to kind of secure some of this infrastructure down, making the request management process route the traffic to where things are supposed to go, making sure that we say, okay, this is going to go there, that's going to go there. So almost creating paths of traffic and saying this traffic will go here, this traffic will go here. Now we could go one step further. We could look and base our security design on the number of users that we have. So if we're looking at and evaluating, I've got less than 100 users, then why can't I put all the servers in one? I mean, for me, that one's really straightforward because you should not have the SQL Server on the same place as SharePoint unless you've got a development environment or you're just playing. The public-facing, external-facing site should never be like that because if I'm clever enough and smart enough to break into that server, I really have everything. So Microsoft tells us that up to 10,000 users, we should look at breaking out. In the real world, we should be looking at breaking out anyway. We should have specific servers for web servers and roles and database infrastructure. Then we could virtualize. Would virtualization bring us a little bit more secure? Well, of course it would, because then we're basically having these host servers that we can secure. Then we're virtualizing. Most of the virtualization platforms have virtual firewalls that we can configure through the infrastructure. So this gives us a different flexibility in building a secure infrastructure. Then we could use fault tolerance into that process. So not only do we have multiple layers, but we have redundant servers. So in the event of something being compromised, we can fail backwards and forwards, and we can have this server there and that server there. And we can have multiple SQL database servers all over the place with an always-on failover. So we can build an infrastructure that is catered for fault tolerance, can actually help us with security. We can go to a full-on fault tolerance where we have mix of infrastructure with clusters, but then of course the same question arises. I now have all of these servers to look after from a security perspective. We could have more servers. We could do failover servers. We could do search optimized farms. We could do full virtualization farms. The endless choices. I actually quite like this one. Medium farm, Office web apps, search articulated one. We have the flexibility of creating very complex to almost very simple SharePoint infrastructures. But the problem is, the thing that we miss out is we miss out about securing that infrastructure. So I suppose the question is, what are we actually protecting against? Because we can buy one server and stick it in the corner and publish it to the world, and nothing will ever happen. We could go ahead and have 1,000 servers and put 1,000,000 firewalls in between, and what are we protecting against? Nothing, because nobody cares. But who are we protecting against? Well, of course, we're protecting against the hackers, aren't we? Everybody's a hacker now, or so everybody seems. These are the anonymous people. They're going to try to gain access. They're going to use brute force attacks. They're going to try and get into the system somehow. But more so, it's opportunists, people that just happen to figure something out. It was interesting the other day when there's been no jailbreaks for the iPhone for quite some time, and then mysteriously out the blue, a group in China released a jailbreak for iOS version 7.1 and upwards, out of the blue. And how did they jailbreak it? Something that's been there for a while that they've just been waiting for. Opportunists. They found this hole and they released the patch so everybody could jailbreak their phone. These are the people that we need to kind of worry about. They gain access to SharePoint using the regular URLs and the endpoints. They're maybe going to look for the disco page, which is going to give us the list of the endpoints using the WSDL so we can find the web services. They're going to be looking for the view LSTS page, which is the site content page, which means that there's going to be potential data leakage at that point. They're going to try and look for _VTI_bin components, which some of that is available to non-authenticated users. Maybe they're going to force user enumeration and go to the user disp page and try to find user accounts. Maybe they're going to try and access common functionalities. They're going to go to the disco page, and then they're going to open up that, get the web server, and use, historically there was 2 vulnerabilities in search principles and get all user collections from the web, where it would allow you to pull down the list of users that are in that system. You don't get passwords, but then I'm 50% of the way there, so I can kind of do all kinds of things at that. So before we get into that, let's go back over here and let's go to Google. So what kind of things are we actually looking at? Now, I've done this test many times. So I'm actually going to go here, and you'll see I'm using some specific syntax. I'm using in_URL_layouts and view lsds.aspx. And then what I'm actually going to do is you'll see there's a bunch of web pages that show up. And these are web pages that are showing this page. Now, hold on a minute. Isn't that page all site content? So I tell you what, let me go back to my Active Directory, and let me take that specific link, and let me put that in my regular SharePoint site. So I'm going to do _layouts, view LSTS. There it is. Why would that page be loaded to the internet? Because that's how it got there. So if I right-click this one and do open page, we'll leave that going. Let's do my money, and then let's do that one. We'll do a couple of them and just see what we get back. So we have 2 that have come back. Oh, we have 3, so we'll leave these loading now. But these are 3 pages, 3 sites that are on the internet, and they actually, for some reason, are exposing this page. So I'm going to add another one just so we have a cross selection. So let's go here. So here we have a page, it's a military page, Marine Corps, my money, which is a finance. Yeah, and I've got a different site, and here I've got a college in Oxford, all exposing that _layouts page for no reason. These are the things that we're trying to protect, and these are the things that we should be looking at as far as secure infrastructure goes. Why would this page ever need to be open? Because quite clearly, if we look at the pages, so if I click this link here and go there, quite clearly this page is supposed to be the public face for this. So why would this need to be open? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. These should never be open to anyone. So let me just close that one and go back to here. mymoney.gov. Why is this showing anyway? This is quite clearly a government site that's sitting here that we can access. So why would this be available? It's a public-facing site. Yet again, it's back to configuration. And so we can go through each of these and the same question. This is a public-facing site. If we go to the home page and load, we can go here. This one. This will be a public-facing site too. So if we look at them, this is the issue. Why are these pages exposing that information? Well, that's because things haven't been configured correctly, and that's the issue. So think of it as me. I'm going to play hacker for a while. I'm going to be coming to your SharePoint environment. I'm going to be trying to look for things and see what I can get access to. Now, this one's quite intriguing because, look, this gives me photos. I can go to staff photos at the university. This is going to load, and there'll be a couple of hundred photos. So that means I now know what people look like. Interesting. It also means that I can probably get more information. I can click on personal sites, and we'll see what happens. So personal sites is here, and I could probably look at the content of here too. So I could go _ layouts, view lsts.aspx, and go here. Now, one thing should happen. At some point, I should get prompted for authentication, but maybe not. But I can go through, and you'll see now I have a list of personal sites. And this isn't my website. This is a live website right now. So I can pick an individual user, and then, of course, I'm now going to a specific site collection that has things that are unique to him. Notice at no point I got asked for authentication, at no point. Now, maybe by design it was supposed to be anonymous. Maybe it wasn't. That's the issue. Lots of these sites are configured in a way that they are exposing content inadvertently by this. Now, of course, we can play even further. I can target and say, I only want to look at military sites, and I can do. So I go into here and click a couple of these, Naval Sea, and you can see a bunch of them that are coming through. It should be loading here. Yep, so I can see. Now, notice this. This is just full of document libraries. What am I going to look for? I want to look for things that stand out, things that are useful for me that I would look at and think, I wonder what that is. Freedom of Information Act Reading Room, Navy Instructions Library, there might be something in there. It's all about me trying to get more information about you, because I'm not going to be able to hack SharePoint. That's not how that works. Now, what I'm going to do, though, is once we've got to this, then I'm going to start playing the game a little bit more. Userdisp.aspx ID equals. So I'm going to then start doing this. I'm going to start going through and looking for user disps at this point. And user disp is the page that will show me individual users. It'll show me details. So this one is an example of what should happen. So I'm going to try and get to this site, and this one should redirect me to the login page. That's what should happen by design. But some sites don't have that. So when I click on other ones, let's see if we can find one that does this, you'll see this one requires also. So this is good. But at some point, these sites were crawled by Google and crawled that information about the individual users. And so here we have personal. Obviously, this one's not that useful, but that just shows me authenticated users. But yet again, I'm anonymous, but actually this one's quite intriguing because I'm technically logged in, even though I'm not, because I'm anonymous. So remember when we talked about that SharePoint is actually pretty secure by design, and then we do something that changes that? Here's an example of that being changed, where I'm authenticated with some kind of GUID, and actually I don't really exist in the system. I didn't log in, but I can now get access to information. So if I click people and groups, I can go through and click on these things and see people there. And what we should see is you don't have permission, you don't have permission. But more than likely, it doesn't happen that way. So we can go through the whole process and see these individual users, and we can click on them. Now, what's the purpose of me showing you this? And the purpose of me showing you this is because this happens more and more and more. And people build SharePoint environments. This one is a prime example. This tells me, isn't that intriguing? That's the admin account for this infrastructure. I don't know the password, but what I do know is that there's a user called this that has some settings, and I can then do something that everybody says would never happen. I can go and do a phishing attack. I could go and do a social engineering attack, and I could call up and try to get more information about SharePoint at this point. And it happens. It happens all the time. So how many other endpoints do we have? So let's just flick back to the slide deck for a second. Let's look at some of these. So let's take the administrative side. This is a list of all the entry points that are available inside SharePoint. So these are the underscore layouts, URLs. So I can actually go into my Google site that I did earlier, and I can type any one of those, and that would then bring back specific pieces of SharePoint that potentially I shouldn't have access to. I could use forms or galleries. I could look into the master page galleries. I could look for web part templates. I could look for all items pages. Often we find a lot of lists that, lots of lists that are available in Google or any other search engine that is exposing content that shouldn't be exposed. And you can pass those in, and you can then see what that content might be. We could then go and say galleries, help pages, lists, login URLs. All of these will help us determine whether it's a SharePoint infrastructure. Look and feel, there's lots of other ones. Notice we're looking for view all site content as a piece of text. We're looking for sign-in, people and groups. We're looking for all site content. These are all terms that you will have heard before. And of course, we can then do the big boy, which is the user groups. So I can go in and start looking for user ASPX, role ASPX, user dis is what we just looked at, view group permissions. These are all things that will help me. Or I could go to the ultimate and look for the web services. And the web services will let me look at what's inside any one of those sites. And that actually generates an XML file that you can look at that will basically say these are all the endpoints that you want to look at. So if I just drag over here, here's for example one here, and this is what it looks like. And this disco file lists the URLs that are needed for all of those. So I can go into this one, take this URL, and then what happens, I can paste that into there, and then this will go ahead and show me those methods. So these are being exposed to the world. And that's not that bad, because these are, by design, they are supposed to be available so SharePoint can use them. Now what does happen is we've seen where individuals have changed permissions, so I can then go into here and I can look at the signature, but sometimes the invoke mechanisms are available to anyone. And now to make that happen, somebody physically has to change permissions, authentication, configuration of the SharePoint infrastructure. But this is available on lots and lots of sites. I can go through and pick a whole bunch of SharePoint sites, and you will get this file that lists out the XML files that are available. So how do we kind of protect it then? Well, let's start right at the back. Let's go to the database. So what are we going to do? We're going to block standard SQL ports. I quite like that idea. Blocking standard SQL ports. Everybody in the world knows what they are, 1433 and 1434. So whenever I'm going to run a piece of software that's going to scan the environment for that, I know what ports to look for. I'm maybe going to configure SQL Server database instances and have them listen on non-standard ports. That would work. But then that's kind of security by obscurity, not necessarily security. We're just basically masking the original endpoint. It's kind of what happens on Windows Azure Services, that when you configure everything, everything is masked to a different port. Maybe I'm going to configure SQL client aliases. These work really well. And these aren't just for security. This is really obscurity again, but this means that we can basically hide the actual server name behind an alias called SQL or whatever it might be. Also, SQL client aliases are quite useful in the event of you having to swap your SQL infrastructure. You just repoint the alias to the other SQL servers that you're using, and then everything continues to work. Configure SQL encryption. So we're going to be talking about TDE. So TDE can be configured on a content database specific. So we can say, you know what, for all of these can be okay, but for this specific site collection or web application that has its own content database, we're going to encrypt it. Implement the firewall rules. So many times do I go into a SharePoint infrastructure and the Windows firewall is turned off. And it's fine if that's how you want that to be, But the reason the Windows firewall is there is to mitigate some of the issues of propagation of malware, for example. That if you have the Windows firewall configured for specific ports, that when something impacts your infrastructure, like a piece of malware, I mean, you all remember, hopefully, if you're old enough, all those years ago, when things like the I Love You virus came out. When that came out, and that propagated very, very quickly through people's infrastructure. If there was Windows firewall policies that would block the port traffic and port access between the servers, that probably would have been stopped dead in its tracks. But at that point, we didn't really have that technology. More importantly, run the best practice security analyzer and use the server hardening guidance that's available. It is documented. There's actually documentation on the Microsoft site for hardening servers. If you really want to, and you're working in military, for example, you may be using the STIGs to harden the servers, but use the best practice analyzer to get a report of your surface area of attack. And utilize group policies. They've been there for a long time. Correct group policies on the servers will mitigate some of the issues that we see from security breaches. And I repeated that line, so there's the link to the guidance that you need to go through. So what about the middle layer? Let's talk about application protection. Firewall policies, number one. This makes perfect sense. We know what the ports are. We know where everything sits. I mean, in fact, if we go and look at our server sitting right here, we know what these are. So if I go to the bindings for my SharePoint Web Services, that is the internal communication, you can see where they sit. They sit at the 32,000 upward. That's where most of that communication takes place. And of course, central administration sits on whatever port you determine. But really, everything resides outside of workflow management, which sits at the 12,000s. It sits inside a specific port range. So we can actually go ahead and configure that inside our firewall policies to allow that to come out. Run the best practice security analyzer again. Make sure we use the guidance. Utilize group policies. And then to repeat the same line again, there's the link to the TechNet article. Best practice security analyzer and server hardening guidance. We can't moan and say that the servers are not secure if we haven't gone through the hardening process to turn off the services that we don't need, turn off all those other bits and pieces that we don't actually need in the infrastructure. Okay. So let's go through and look at a general overview of blocking and protecting everything. So what we need to do is we're going to look at blocking the standard SQL Server ports. This is going to be the big one that we need to look at. Did we just go? I think I may have repeated the slide. Oh, no. Okay. So this is just reconfirming, configuring the SQL instances. And what I want to do is if we just go across over here onto our servers and do CLI config, you'll see that I actually have done this right here. So my server name is called Nimbus, which is my dev box, but my alias is actually SQL. And if I go into, let me just launch central administration again, and then I go manage servers in this farm, what you should see is that this is my SQL server, not the name of the server. Obviously, it kind of defeats the point because it's a single server box. But if it was an infrastructure, you would have all of your server names, and then you would have this alias. So I can reroute that traffic at any point. If I now need to move that to Nimbus number 3 or whatever it might be, I simply come and edit this SQL alias, restart the services, and then SharePoint comes over. Notice also it has the port, and if I was using a specific port, then I could come in and say I want to use that as the port for SQL Server. Now, in order for that to work, obviously we need to configure SQL Server to respond to those individual ports. And our SQL configuration allows us to specify those aliases and those protocols that we have access to. So you'll see for my SQL Server connection, my client protocols, it says it's 1433, which is by default. But this is where we can make changes, we can configure it differently, we can then do a map between different ports and different servers if we need to. Someone just posted a comment, which is a valid point too. Aliases also help in the upgrade. So thank you, Christopher, for reminding me on that one. It's good to use aliases, not just from security, but for being able to manage things going forward. It's much easier when you're upgrading and moving databases around and having to rename servers and things like that. You know what it's like. The servers are called ABC one day, and then you get a new manager comes in and says, I want to rename them all like this. This way, SQL aliases cater for that really, really well. Use SQL encryption. Encryption, this is based around having keys that you generate in SQL Server. Now, I'm not going to go through this process, but you create the keys, and obviously what you don't do is store those keys in the same place as the database. So what we do is we take those keys and store them somewhere else, and the beauty behind this is if I was to compromise the system and get access to that infrastructure, that I could steal the databases and then I'd go home and try to restore them to a database server at home, I'm physically incapable of doing so because I don't have the encryption keys that are needed to put that back. Implement the server firewalls. Let's go back to here for a second. Server firewalls are really straightforward. So I'm going to open up my control panel, System and Security, Windows Firewall. Now, of course, everybody sees this and they're like, but if you go to Advanced Settings and we do inbound and outbound, this is where we're able to configure the ports that are needed for those services. And it's very straightforward, as simple as saying new rule, and we can do a port-specific rule, and then we can go in and assign the rules and say, I want to allow 1445, for example, which will be my new SQL port, and I want to allow the connection, I want to customize the connection, I want to go through and say all of the networks that it's connected to are going to work, and then the names that are available. So you can do this on a per server basis. There are some scripts out there that have been done where you can run PowerShell commands that will go ahead and add firewall rules specifically into the servers. So what you would end up with is if I just go back through the slide deck for a second, tell you what, let me just click through the slide deck and go back up a bit further. Always fun doing it in reverse. This one, excuse me, you'll see that we can put firewall rules on each server piece to allow that specific traffic to come backwards and forwards. Now, this is not an easy task. What you would need to do is you would need to put something in between to monitor and make sure that you just didn't block all the rest of the traffic, but that you actually were able to pass traffic through normally, but restrict it to just the ones that SharePoint actually requires. We actually did some work for that a while back. It's actually an interesting task to go through and look at the ports going backwards and forwards so we can see what's going on with the servers. So I'm just going to flick back through again. Let's go back through here, and no, we'll go back through. It went too far. So the best practice security analyzer, we've talked about this. Use the server hardening guidance, use group policies, and this one for me is number one. Only open required ports. Too often we tend to open. So this is kind of the logic that takes place. And maybe I'm wrong on this one, but I've seen this so many times where we build a SharePoint infrastructure. It's built inside the organization, and then somebody comes and says, hey, SharePoint can be an extranet. Let's just do this. And so what happens is they open a firewall port to port 80 and 443. They point it directly to the SharePoint server, and then off they go. And that's how the extranet gets built. Very straightforward. There's often no thought process that goes into that. So when we're looking at plugging the holes, that's not how we should be looking at building infrastructures. we should be taking the time to only open the required ports where we need them. You know, if we don't need port 80 and we're going to run it over SSL, which, by the way, for external traffic, you should be running over SSL, then that's all we need to have open. Unless there's a requirement to have 80 open also, we should just be able to use 443. Use firewalls in between the perimeters or between each layers. This will help you outside of your Windows firewalls to secure that. So, for example, if you're using VMware as an example, VMware has the idea of firewall virtual appliances that sit between all the multiple layers of the servers. And that's a great idea. Historically, we would have done IPsec policies, for example, on the servers back in the day. I know when I worked on some projects with Microsoft years ago, we did have IPsec policies. And they would control which server could talk to which server by which ports and which endpoints could go where, to ensure that there was no way that somebody could just hop between server to server to server to server. That's really what we're trying to protect against. Use SSL encryption. Now, of course, in the news over the past couple of months, we've had a whole bunch of slew of news come out about SSL and Open SSL and all those different things. There's no reason why we shouldn't be using SSL encryption, at least for the access of the endpoint coming in. So when I go to my SharePoint environment externally, it should be over SSL. And no, we shouldn't be using an SSL certificate that's encrypted at 1024 or maybe even 2048. We should be going for 4096 or higher. So we need to look at getting SSL certificates with the highest encryption rates possible. And instead of buying those $12 ones that you can get, maybe it's time to look at a better certificate and securing things properly. Just because you have an SSL certificate doesn't mean that somebody can't break into the system. In fact, you all know the story of the contents being released onto WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning and all that kind of fun stuff. All the stuff that he had access to was over SSL, but using a tool like wget, just to download those tools, there's a flag that says ignore the SSL certificate, and hey presto, it just downloads all the files. So be aware there are things that we should be doing. Use SSL inspection solutions too. These will help us to inspect the traffic that's going backwards and forwards. We should be able to put something there that says, oh, this is a malformed packet that I wasn't expecting. Why is that there? And inspect what comes in. Because I can do it with Fiddler. I can perform a man-in-the-middle attack using Fiddler because I can sit at the side, open the website, everything gets decrypted, because a man-in-the-middle attack is all about representing the certificate that you're expecting with another certificate that you trust. And so that means I'm able to see and decrypt the packets so I can see what's going on. Now, Fiddler is obviously me doing it as individual, but there are plenty of pieces of software, mostly based around the Linux platform, that will allow me to do that on a large scale. And this one for me is the big one. Offload your authentication. This is one of the big things. Too often, we just publish SharePoint. It's using Active Directory Auth, and then we expect people outside to just log in using Active Directory credentials in a standard Windows pop-up box that comes up, and then we authenticate. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but think of the flow for a second. I open up my laptop, I'm working at home, or I'm in an internet cafe. I type in, I'm using SSL because I want to be secure. I type in HTTPS, SharePoint.com, and then it prompts me for authentication with a Windows box. Now, where has that Windows box come from? Well, that's not come from SharePoint. SharePoint just says, hey, I need to be authenticated. So I'm now being presented an authentication request from IIS. So I'm effectively on the server. I'm not really on the server, but the server is presenting me with what is required. And then the server presents that information back to Active Directory. It authenticates me and gets into SharePoint. Now, think of it a little bit differently. What about if when I access SharePoint and it asked me for authentication request, it threw me somewhere else? Like with the custom identity provider mechanism, where it threw me to a completely different site. That means that the authentication process is not on the SharePoint servers. It's nowhere near the SharePoint servers. It's 1,000 miles away from the SharePoint servers. And when I've authenticated, and only when I've authenticated, am I allowed back to the SharePoint infrastructure. And that's an important key. And that's why we tend to find a lot of solutions that we're working with right now. They're doing offload authentication using ADFS or some of the third-party federation platform, even for internal users, because they want to offload the authentication away from SharePoint and let SharePoint do what it's good at, and then allow the authorization authentication piece to be done from the Federation Gateway. So how else do we plug the holes then? So this is the first one. We need to ensure that we use the View Form Pages Lockdown feature. Now, the websites that we showed earlier, so in my Google window, when I went in and did the underscore layouts view LSTS page, so if I just flick across again, you'll see these pages that we went through, and we can open up another one and see how it loads. These pages here that we're exposing the view LSTS page, this is probably because, I mean, they're showing because that feature isn't enabled. What's probably happened is that when they built the site, and this looks very much like a team site, that the site was built like team sites, which doesn't have that feature enabled. That feature comes by physically enabling that. And what tends to happen is many clients and websites that I've seen over the past year or so have been built using the wrong site template. So they build it using a team site, and then they go, oh, I can't change the master page. So what do? They enable the publishing features, and then they think they're good to go. And they are to a certain extent, but that does not enable the View Form Pages Lockdown, which is why I can get to this, the View LSTS page. As soon as that feature is enabled, these pages are no longer available. So that's rule number one. Rule number one is ensure View Form Pages Lockdown feature is enabled. And if you've built your infrastructure, let's say you're starting from scratch today, make sure you choose the right template and make sure the features are enabled. 2013 does better because it has that enabled by default, and you have to physically turn that off to not use it. Monitor access to the SharePoint environment. No one ever does this because it means you'd have to read log files. But this is important because it takes, right now, an average of 90-something days for a company to, well, actually, I think the actual figure was more like 200, but the average enterprise, it takes about 90-plus days for them to discover a security breach in their environment. That's a long time. So think of that. When you are using your SharePoint environment, 9 times out of 10, it becomes a mission-critical application. And so we should be monitoring access to the SharePoint environment. Look at the log files, go and get third-party products that can run reports that say, you know, Joe Blogs has got access to this. We should be monitoring that access so we know. And if we're using offloaded authentication, then we should be logging the authentication requests. If we've developed the authentication process, then we should be logging that somewhere so we can go back and say, here's my access control lists for SharePoint for the past month. Why does this person keep trying to get in? And then you'll then start to build a picture of who's been accessing SharePoint and who hasn't. A big thing for me is that we need to control who can delete the logs, because this is all about covering yourself up. Administrators can go onto the server, they can clear the event viewer, they can clear the log files as if nothing has ever happened. Now think of the 2 biggest breaches that kind of involve SharePoint in some description. The 2 big ones were obviously Bradley Manning and then some of the Snowden stuff. Now they all had access to the servers. They were administrators. But there wasn't many log files that was left over that said, oh, so-and-so tried to get into the platform. So it's time to put a policy in place that says, you know what, the administrators can't just delete the logs. We need to have some ownership and some accountability for those administrators using the platform. We need to be able to check for these 3 SQL injection vulnerabilities, brute force password attacks, and cross-site scripting. There's many ways of checking for those. SQL injection attack, I stand by a statement that I always make, that SharePoint out of the box is not vulnerable to a SQL injection attack. And I clarify out of the box as in I'm using Active Directory, because it isn't. As soon as we implement something that requires custom code, then potentially it becomes vulnerable to SQL injection attack. brute force password attacks. You can go online, download a tool that will basically brute force a Windows login, and if the site is configured so I can get a username out, then I just need to guess a password, and I can do a brute force attack with the password. And cross-site scripting is all about phishing, really. It's all about social, kind of trying to interact with individuals using phishing techniques by sending cross-site scripting attacks that will help them, make them reveal information about them that they don't want. Control the search results. This has happened a few times where people have cross-pollinated search results. They've misconfigured security, or they've tried to be clever and write web parts that would bring the search results back anonymously, even though you don't have permission. We've seen a whole host of different things. Let SharePoint do what it's good at, and don't modify the underlying infrastructure and architecture to circumvent something that's there. Pen test the SharePoint site. This is the big one. I'm a great proponent of this, that we should be looking at pen testing the SharePoint environment, looking for those security issues, and going through the site with a fine-tooth comb almost to go through and say, okay, is this available? Is my site, what's gone wrong? Why is this showing? Why is that not showing? Going through that process and looking at one by one. For internal, you can kind of choose. How much do you trust your internal users? That's really what it comes down to. For external, there should be no choice. You should want to go through and do a penetration test. You should want to go through and check, can I get to all of these virtual directories? I mean, if we go back to our server infrastructure and take my identity provider one, you can see the big list of folders, virtual folders that are available inside SharePoint. This is just the IIS ones. And I can click on _VTI bin, and you'll see there's the WSDL pages, there's web services. There's a whole host of pages that, for me, as a hacker right now, I'm going to go in and start looking through those pages because I want to know what's in there. You've got other configuration files. You've got trust. I've got web config entries. I've got all kinds of different things. The layouts folder is full of things that you really don't want me to have to go through. So how can we mitigate some of that? I mean, SharePoint does a pretty good job. Using the View Form Pages lockdown feature will fix some of that. But one of the things that we can do, let me just open up my identity provider. I think I already had this one open, but we'll double check. One of the things that we can do is I can utilize this mechanism here. I can use what's called location path. So location path mechanisms allow me to specify specific syntax that will say, okay, everybody can get to this or nobody can get to this. So if I take this one, location images, and if we go back to my Google site and paste in location images, then you'll see that there's a bunch of images, things that show up, and some of these are available to anonymous users. And that's really based around these flags where it says allow users. What we could actually do is we could go in and say deny users, and then we can specify I want to deny all the users, which you probably want, or you can specify that and say only authenticated users or whatever it might be. So you have the flexibility of building location path mappings in the web config that would restrict access to certain locations. Now, the gotcha here is you have to be very careful when doing this. We did this recently. We had a set that we normally used, and then when we implemented 2013, we found that something else impacted that, and some of the later 2010 stuff, that when we did crawl, we were actually having a deny override the crawl engine, and it was blocking some content. But you can go ahead and build. So if we were to, let's say we took a copy of this one here, and I went down to here like this, and then said, well, why don't we just do view lsts.aspx, and then I'm going to allow authenticated users, then that means that the next person that comes to that page that was available for anonymous will now require authentication. And because if we're not using the View Form Pages lockdown, then this is the way of doing it. So there's two approaches. If we're not using view form pages lockdown, which quite clearly on some of those websites that we went to, they're not using that. So if we go back in the browser for a second and look at these, so if we take any, so we take this one right here that loads. To fix this one, if this one decides to load, all it would take is to enable that view form pages lockdown or to put the web config entry specifically to force authentication. So then it would just redirect to the authentication process. But it's always good fun to use this and go through because you then see how many results. But over the past year, this has got less and less and less and less. If I go back to that, you'll see we still have quite a few that are struggling that are not military ones. Or we can go through the same process and do Gov, and you'll see there's 4,500 Gov websites that have the same problem, that are exposing content for no reason. Now, in a penetration test, these would come up because you would see this. When the penetration test hit the site, it would go through and say, these are the entry points that I can see, and I would see something like this format come up, and it would say, oh, these are all the documents that I can see. Obviously, if I take the base type out and go back to there, then I get everything that comes back, including sites and lists and all that. And what's more important is when we're doing these tests is we need to think of what lists people would potentially be created. I can't see that. All items are ASPX. So what we can do here is you'll see I'm just looking for some specific syntax. We know that all items ASPX is a SharePoint page. We also know that lists/something is a SharePoint configuration. And so we can go through and do a search and say, hey, I'm looking for list config, and this site happens to have one called config, and then we have a configuration list. Now think that through for a second. That's a list in a SharePoint site that somebody created that has configuration values. We can then do the same thing and check it again and see if that comes up for configuration. Or what we could do is we could replace this completely and say users, all users.aspx. And so we can then start to go through and see if there's sites that match this list. And we can do other search terms. So you can go through and find all of these. And I would suggest that the first thing you go through with your own SharePoint site is to go through and check things like this. How many users are there? Are they showing up in this list? So when I do all users and all items, do I get users that show up? Are they being exposed? Because this is important, because once I get a list of user accounts, I don't need the passwords because I can brute force that, or I can do a social engineering attack. So the penetration test will help find some of these. And if you're looking for penetration tools that are available, if you're a Linux fan, then you can download this tool here, which is called Kali Linux, which is the main one. And Kali Linux will let you download a ISO or VMware image that has lots and lots of tools that will allow you to perform a penetration test against web applications. Now, it doesn't have anything specifically SharePoint related, but the tools that are there will work against the SharePoint environment. So, a big one for me, I suppose one of the final things for me, is to ensure that you update with patches. Security patches, cumulative updates, emergency patches. The rule that we have here at Protiviti is that we stay 2 behind the current cumulative update unless the infrastructure that we're looking at requires that patch for a fix. And the reason we do that is just because we know that those patches often get recalled because of regressions and issues. So we stay 2 behind and only go forward if we need to. But that gives us time to test and to patch those, to test them before we release them out to the wild. So we do 2 behind every single time. And this one for me is learn to publish SharePoint correctly. 90% of the issues and the things that we talked about and showed today are because it wasn't published correctly. Because it was an application, somebody wanted it, someone read that you could do it, so they did it. I often use an analogy when I've spoken at conferences before. It's called the flat pack syndrome. The idea is that you go and buy flat pack furniture, And you know what it's like, especially as men, we don't like to read the instructions. So we build the flat pack furniture, and of course we know there's always a couple of things left over, but we happen to end up with a couple more, and we look at it and go, looks all right, you're good to go. That's not really how this works with SharePoint and with external facing, and really internal facing now. It needs to be done correctly and not done like we build flat pack furniture. So we've got a few minutes early, we'd finished. So I want to thank you for attending and leave some time for some questions. At the moment we have a couple of questions on here. The one question that came through was, what method of authentication would you say the DoD CAC is? So the DoD CAC authentication, for those that don't know, is an authentication mechanism that uses a CAC card. The CAC card basically is the multi-factor authentication middle tier for a regular Windows kind of logon process. It doesn't really fall into any one of the categories, because most of the time that infrastructure is directly connected to an Active Directory of some description or a federated infrastructure that's talking to Active Directory. So it kind of fits into both those camps. But it's not a federation platform as such, because it's an isolated authentication mechanism. I've actually done some work with clients before for the DoD CAC kind of environments, and that process is really working just like a multi-factor. So your default authentication is backed up by you providing a PIN code and a CAC card in order for that to work. So if you have any more questions, feel free to post them into the questions window.
So Liam, this is Jason. Just while folks are maybe typing in some questions, maybe we could display that the information on the...
Okay. There we go.
Yeah, so just to reconfirm, we mentioned this at the beginning, but we are holding a 2-day administration and architecture course. We're actually holding many courses. The next one is administration and architecture in Chicago, July 15th and 16th, taught by another SharePoint MVP. The link there takes you to not only that course, but also our entire schedule of public courses, and you can learn more about our private training offerings there at the website as well.
So there was a question that came in, Jason, which was, will we provide a link to the recording?
Yes, we will.
Okay. Okay. Where did that go? So my question window detached itself and then hid somewhere else. So question was, the view form pages lockdown feature is what scope? So the view form pages lockdown feature is actually, depending on what version of SharePoint, it can be a hidden one. So in 2007 it was hidden. In 2013 it's called something else now. But in 2010 it was a hidden feature also. It's at the web application, it's actually at the site collection level. It's not at the farm level itself. So when you have a web application, when you go into the site collection, there's actually a feature that you can then enable at that point. It has a specific GUID that you can, I can't remember the exact GUID reference, otherwise I would send it to you, but you can look for that specific feature if you're not using a 2013 farm. I'm actually just going to open up let me just go to my 2013 site, and I'll bring this over and show you the feature if you're using 2013. Okay, so if I go back over here for a second, you'll see in 2013 it's actually at the site collection level, and it's called Limited Access User Permission Lockdown Mode. So they gave it a different name. They made it an actual feature that you could turn on and turn off. But in 2010 and 2007, it's one that you have to get via PowerShell or STS-ADM and then activate and deactivate. But 2013, I'm obviously using a publishing portal for this, and so it's activated by default. I hope that answers your question, Bob. So while we're seeing for any more questions, the slide that's on there right now is just the breakdown of the administration site that we do. Some of the things that we talked about today, we would actually talk about a little bit more in detail, and we go through the process of configuring some of these from start to finish. So Module 5, for example, which kind of closely relates to what we're talking about, the identity management, authentication, and security. We do go through the configuration of membership and role providers, custom identity providers, some custom code and security that goes all the way through that. And then when we get to user profiles and solutions and apps, we talk about that process too, and it's all hands-on. So if you look for admin training and you want to make sure you cover some of the security, this is the course. It covers everything, more or less everything that we went through today, but obviously stretched into a course, and it's all hands-on.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is when we see Each with Labs, all the students get an individual virtual environment to work within as the instructor walks through exercises, so everybody has those labs to actually literally hands-on do it and do the exercises yourselves.
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions.
Great. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for attending the security webinar, and thank you, Liam, for all the information, lots of great information that was shared today. Certainly, if there are any questions, let us know at SharePointTraining@protiviti.com, and we'll be happy to get you those answers. Thanks again to everyone for attending.